So, what are the barriers to entry for people of different races coming into poly? I'm here with Kevin A. Patterson from polyrolemodels.tumblr.com. I'm Cathy Bertoli from the intimacydojo.com. And I hear that you have an amazing book coming out called Love is Not Colorblind. And you were talking, when we were talking about it a few minutes ago, you were talking about the barriers to entry. And I'd love if you'd, could you go a little bit deeper? What is you said class is one of the barriers to entry. Would you be willing to share about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, polyamory costs money. And when you say that, people kind of cringe and try to leave every possible free thing they've ever done in any relationship and try to use that as sort of a bludgeon to end the conversation.
Oh.
But polyamory costs money.
Yeah.
It costs time and money. Where anytime you're not working and making money, you're expending emotional energy. If you're trying to expend emotional energy in a bunch of different directions, if you're trying to date, if you're trying to go to meetups, if you're trying to go to any conferences, there's money involved. Like even Netflix and chill costs Netflix. Like that. These are all costs that you have to pour into anything you're doing. Building relationships with multiple people, it all costs money. And if you're a part of a community that is traditionally marginalized, like people of color in American society, that's a burden to you.
Yeah.
Things like redlining and segregation and slavery. All these things are these multi-tiered oppressions that don't wash away over the course of a year or a decade or a century. And if you're part of a community that's been marginalized in that way, I don't have the numbers directly in front of me, but I think the average black household is $26,000 under the average in America. That's $26,000 a year that you're not spending doing other things with your life, you know? And one of those other things is polyamory.
Yeah.
So if I'm having a happy hour and it's on the ritzy part of town, there's only certain people who are going to be able to make it to that happy hour, and that's a barrier for entry. If I'm having a happy hour and it's not accessible by public transit, if I have to pay for babysitting,
right?
As opposed to these are all things that cost money. And if you're part of a community, if you're part of a population where money is sort of on the down, it's going to affect your polyamory in a major way.
Absolutely.
And people don't want to talk about it because it's hard to talk about.
Well, it's incredibly sad that people can't find love and find relationships that really fit who they are because of we all say we want to believe love is free and everyone gets to get that. And it is. I have a couple lovers that are in other parts of the state or whatever. We have to fly to see each other or take a train or a bus, and that's time away from work, time we're not cleaning the house there's definitely an impact. I can definitely see how that would be really challenging for people that don't have as much financial ease. Yeah.
Yeah, and racism isn't an easy conversation to have. Class isn't an easy conversation to have. And how race and class intersect is really not an easy conversation to have. And people who are trying to go to their local poly cocktails event, they just want to have a drink and talk about polyamory.
Yeah.
They're not necessarily evil or wrong people, but all they really want to do is have a drink, socialize, maybe meet someone to love, maybe meet someone to get laid, and they don't want to hear or they don't want to have these conversations about who's not able to make it to that poly cocktails event because of where it's situated, how expensive it is to get there, how expensive it is to be there.
Mm-hmm. Well, and a lot of the meetups, I organize out of my house, but I work in a corporate area too, and if I'm going to have a meetup someplace else, I might have it near my job, which is a little bit more expensive, and there's not as much public transportation. And if I'm not aware of that, it's just, I'm like, well, of course everyone can make it. They just hop on their car and get here, but not everybody has a car, and not everyone has a babysitter.
I host potlucks in my house all the time. Whenever I get an idea of hey, I feel like watching some movies, I basically turn it into a potluck and watch those movies with
that's very cool.
People from my local community. And it's easy for me to do because potlucks are relatively inexpensive. They're relatively low maintenance people show up with their dishes and then they take those dishes home with them.
You don't have to wash them.
Yeah, I always set up some room in my basement for kids, so no one has to worry about childcare. Just show up. I'll put some kids movies on down in the basement while we're watching
That's wonderful.
Paul Verhoeven movies up in the living room.
Yeah.
But then I don't live that near to mass transit.
Yeah.
So that's a barrier for entry for some people. Like there's some people who are like, well, I want to come, but I don't want to have to take the train to the bus only to have to then walk to your house.
Yeah.
And that's not something I could do anything about because it's my house. But if I'm hosting an event that's not in my home, these are all things that I'm going to have to consider.
Yeah. Well, and if
Right.
you're hosting it someplace close to mass transit, you may have to rent it, pay money for it, which is another. Yeah. One thing I do on my meetup is I encourage people, if they're driving, to see if they can give rides to each other, and that sometimes works. But sometimes people aren't near each other and they're kind of stuck.
Yeah, absolutely, and I do the same, But these are all things you have to consider before you can call your event accessible,
Yeah.
before you can call your event welcoming.
Yeah.
These are all things that you really have to stop and think about. And if you don't, then you don't really have a right to say, well, everyone's welcome. Like everyone's welcome who can make it there.
It's can afford it, and yeah. Well, I really appreciate you sharing that, because I think there's a lot of people, myself included, sometimes I'm like, I wasn't aware of something, and the more we can be aware, the more we can make a difference. And we can't always fix everything, like you said. You can't make a bus stop appear near your house, but
yeah,
the more we can lower those barriers and let everybody have access to that, I really appreciate your generosity in sharing this.
Hey, thanks. I'm glad we both had the time.
Yeah, it was great. If you have comments, questions, please leave them below. We'd love to hear what you think.